Okay, so begin with item 2, open time for public regarding non-agenda items. Do we have anything? Anybody?
Let's first do a little bit of, we'll just do a quick roll call just to
Oh, pardon me.
log it in there. I'm gonna take the roll.
Okay.
Sure, I'm going to take the roll.
Hi.
Perfect in time.
Good. Good. We're taking roll right now.
I'll start at this side. Glenn Roth, Larry Reed, Carl Spursum,
Here?
Karen Lang,
Here.
DC.
Here.
Welcome.
Okay. Item 2, open time regarding public non-agenda items. Do we have any emails or inquiries or anybody on the line?
Nobody online? There's no one online and nobody here for.
Okay.
And I should say this is the first time that Chris is trying to do double duty here, which is a skill in and of itself of actually monitoring the Zoom and the online and making sure people are coming in there and also obviously helping run.
And helping me at the same time.
Yes, exactly. So there's
three chores there.
So we're gonna make it through, but we'll get better as we have additional meetings.
Okay.
Phoebe, yeah, I know Karen's familiar with Phoebe, who's like a pro at it with the Climate Action Committee now at this point. So we'll get there, Chris.
Okay, well then we'll move on to item 3, general business. First to do is approve the minutes from the September 24, 2025 Financial Advisory Committee meeting.
Through the chair, before the meeting, I noticed that I made Glenn Roth our youth member. So if you'd like to stay that way, but other than that, I would like to amend that for you.
I was not aware of that. I chuckled. I was sort of honored, I have to say. I was briefly insulted, then very momentarily honored by that. So you can remove it. I don't even know what that is. No one told me, but it's fine. Whatever.
That was on me. I apologize.
Okay.
We'll stick with it. Okay, I heard a motion to approve the minutes. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, motion.
I'll take all in favor.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Okay. Moving on to item B, review and discussion of the September 30, 2025 investment report. I'll hand that off.
Thank you, Chair. So, quarterly, the town provides a treasurer's report to council, and this report just reflects the various cash balances that the town has. This is a snapshot or moment in time at that date. I had a quick quick discussion about just what some of these balances might mean. So the operating account sitting at about $500,000. So pretty much at that time, we're waiting for checks to clear. I log in every morning and just see what's pending and try and move it over, acting sort of like a sweep. Same sort of thing for our payroll account. These are non-interest bearing accounts. The ambulance account, that is money that is deposited by the various billings related to the ambulance service through Central Marin Fire. And then both the interest-bearing accounts, the LAIF and Bank of Marin Money Market account. And then finally, the pension reserve, which is sitting with Concourse. And of course, if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer those for you.
The ambulance billing account. Oh, yeah. There we go. The ambulance billing account. You mentioned in the narrative that there's a third party that the third party that delivers the services. So how does that work in terms of just billing and then paying them?
Sure. So Central Marin Fire has Medic 14. Medic 14 goes out not just here in Corte Madera. If you were to review some of the reports available through the fire council, you'd see that they go almost all over the county. And then we bill if they have insurance, and then we through a third party, Sharps, I believe, is the majority, and that bills for us, whether that's Kaiser or the various insurance companies, and then through them we collect those monies. They do deposit in that account, and then sometimes, depending on insurance plans, there are some refunds and things that happen within that account. It takes a bit to manage between ourselves, myself and Central Marin Fire, but that's generally how that flows. And
Just curious about the logistics of that.
I'll just say something about this. I was talking to Chris earlier. I was questioning why there's no effective yield on what looks to be safely over $1 million. And what I learned is this is a snapshot, and these accounts really aren't at these levels all the time. And I was just curious why we weren't earning interest. And so it made a lot more sense that these accounts go up and down in balances constantly. So it made a lot more sense to me why that's the case.
Yeah.
So if you want to.
yeah, I'll volunteer a little more through the chair. So these funds, you can probably see they're either at or above the FDIC limit of $250,000. Public funds in California, state law says that any institution that holds public funds must hold $1.10 for every dollar in public funds in certain types of securities. And most institutions have to have those securities held by a third party. So for example, the bank goes belly up, we can go get that money held in security by the bank by a third party, which is another reason. When I talk with the bankers, I always ask, can we get a sweep account? Can we get interest? They're not going to do that for us because they've got to hold all these securities over there, which can be kind of expensive, but it also protects the tax.
So that collateral is sequestered and identifiable and all that?
It is. You'd have to go into the bank's prospectus to find that information and exactly what securities, but those securities are dictated by state law. And of course, the regulators, we rely on them to keep a close eye on that and make sure that that is in fact the case. And, I've been around long enough to see banks go belly up. So I worry about that stuff as much as anybody.
Chris, and then 100% of the balance is collateralized.
For every dollar, they have $1.10.
So for like 100% of the funds.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. Exactly. And all of these, including the interest-bearing money market account. We are restricted in that money market account. I think I explained that in the earlier staff report. We can only take 6 withdrawals from that. So that kind of allows them to buy some longer term securities to help make up, that forward. I think right now they're 4.34, but I got notice yesterday they were going to 4.25. So.
Can you talk a little louder? Sometimes-
sure.
Sometimes you
So
talk down.
so sorry. Thank you. I'll start where BC asked, and that was on collateralization. So yes, for every dollar that a town or any municipality, public agency puts in a bank or any institution, that institution has to have $1.10 in collateralization to cover the public funds that institution is holding. And generally that is held by a third party.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that was one of my questions. It looked like we have a few accounts with Bank of Marin, and I was trying to see if there was any risk or concerns with concentration of funds being in just one institution, but looks like what you explained kind of helps that. Thanks.
The risk isn't on collateralization. The risk is these days is really around fraud and of course banks going belly up, and also yeah.
Yep, that's helpful.
I don't know if Chris, you want to expand a bit on the discussion here, if folks are familiar with all the different buckets of money. So we've got sizable buckets, the CDs, we have the pension reserve, we've got the sanitary district reserve. If people have questions on that, do we want to go through that, or are we all good there?
I think
It's written here. I didn't know if people had questions about it.
I read through it if you want to briefly go through it, that would be fine.
Sure. So all of the reserves that are identified in the report, those were designated by council. And so for us to dip into those, we would have to go to council and say, okay, we kind of run through our budget or we've run through our undesignated reserves and we need to move into that. So that's really what those reserves are about. Occasionally a municipality will have internal reserves like computer reserve or building maintenance or something like that that isn't necessarily designated by council. But once it's designated as the ones that are in this report, those are designated by council. So we have to go to them and to get into that, even though it might be sitting in the same bank account.
Can you tell me, so how did the reserves come about? Is that from surpluses in the past?
Exactly. You have the town being well managed, having surpluses, budgeting for surplus, and then just being prudent over the years. It's not any one year. For example, tonight we're going to ask that you move money out of the general fund and move it into other funds. Then we'll take that to council. Council will then maybe take that recommendation or modify it in some way. Once it's moved into those funds, then it's designated into the use of those funds based on what council says we can do with it.
Okay. All right, well, let's move on to item C, the meat of our meeting here, and discuss, uh, review the preliminary actuals, discussion and possible action to make recommendations to the town council on possible uses for the 2024-2025 surplus. So I'll hand it off.
Thank you, Chair. And
Let me know if you want help with that aspect of the show.
sure, kind of, we might get up and point around a little bit as you ask for some clarity. As I pointed out in the staff report, preliminarily, and by preliminary, I mean, when the audit's done, then we're really done. We still have to get through the audit, which we're working on concurrently. But preliminarily, we have operating revenues minus expenses. We have a $3.6 million surplus before transfers. And year to date, the council has already designated certain transfers, which you can see in the report. Excuse me. After those transfers, we really have an undesignated surplus of about $1.2 million. After we go through all the reserves, and so on, and I'll talk about this a little bit when we get into the report, but we have an undesignated general fund balance of about $3.1 million. What we're recommending tonight is to look to you for some sort of recommendation regarding that $1.2 million in surplus from this year. And there's a couple opportunities that I put forward, that we put forward, possibly just leaving it alone, an undesignated general fund balance, and that'll just kind of leave us in a real cushy spot to get through, plenty of cash on hand. Transferring some money into the town capital fund. The town has a lot of capital needs. In this current year, we've identified all the funding for the projects the council has identified to do. But as we get into those out years, we have some very expensive projects, particularly related to climate adaptation. And then also another recommendation is putting some money into the recreation capital fund. And again, there are some projects within the park master plan that need some funding. And then also, if you have some other ideas or would like to make a different recommendation, that's also possible. So what I've provided here is just our general fund summary. That's this report here. Yes.
Can you just step back a little bit? So you had the $3.6 million surplus, and then the net transfers of 2.4 million, general fund surplus of 1.2, and then we go back to 3.1. I guess I'm confused between having a 3.6 million surplus, but then 2.4. Yeah, how does that work? I'm sorry, I'm confused between the 3.6 surplus, 2.4 net transfers back to 1.2 and then back to 3.1. How does that all work? Okay, great.
Here, you want to take this?
That's the one I'll zoom in, yeah. So, it's this page right here. And so we're really talking about this column right here. So here is total revenue, operating revenue, general fund operating revenue, and then general fund operating expenses, leaving us a surplus of about $3.6 million. And then we have these transfers in and out. This comes from our sales tax fund, if you're familiar with that. So that comes in to pay for it's project management. And then we have these other transfers out that council has designated over the last year. So already $1 million going into town capital, $1 million going in, 1.1 million going into the technology fund, wildfire mitigation, and then 400,000 into the rec capital. So net transfers of 2.4. So take this surplus less these transfers designated by by council, and that leaves us just kind of a year-end net surplus after some of these things that council decided to do earlier in the year. So this is the amount of money that I'm recommending that this commission consider making some recommendations around. If we start here, here's our beginning general fund balance way at the top. After all this stuff happens, we end up with this ending fund balance, right? So we start with this, we add in this revenue, we subtract out the expenses, and we end up here with 16 million. And then we kind of go through all of these reserves that we were just talking about a minute ago. And these are all, well, this section is the reserves. We also have some other funds that we account for here, and I'd be glad to talk about those a little bit. The Park Madera deficit, which is related to some property. We account for that within the general fund. And then same thing with the recreation fund, which is not included in the general fund at request of council, as I understand, but it really is a general fund expense. And so we put the surplus or deficit here to help account for it within the general fund. And then we have these reserves, so we can't touch any of this. This is real cash we can't touch. And so total reserves of about $12 million leaves us with undesignated. This means council hasn't designated it to be transferred. It's not a designated reserve. Free cash flow. It's kind of the way I see it. So that's what we have left. And so this is, again, this is the amount that we're kind of recommending.
So once again, you're adding essentially back in funds that are really designated to something else, other surplus funds. So
We're
that we
taking them
really
out.
only.
We're saying, no, you can't
to-
touch. This is protected.
Okay, all right.
And maybe for Carl and Larry, who've had conversations in past years through the ad hoc committee, it's a little bit of a different approach. I will say that, and I appreciate Chris's approach here. I know with Daria, our prior finance director, sometimes we would talk and have this conversation and we'd include all of the undesignated ending fund balance as well in that conversation. But I think in talking to Chris and Chris's approach is really that's cash on hand that we actually should keep in an undesignated ending fund balance rather than sort of sock it away and designate it for the purpose of, it could be timing of cash flow or other needs that may occur during the course of the year, and especially in that first year. So we're never actually dipping into the reserves once we start a new fiscal year. So that's really just, I think it took I don't know if this is probably going to sound, it's not going to make much sense unless you've been part of the prior conversations around this, but it's the reason we're talking about 1.27 million instead of adding that to a 3.1 as well and talking about a much larger amount.
I think it would be good to have the labels sort of clarify that a little bit. Maybe this one,
I think the labels are, which labels specifically, maybe?
well, just somehow, okay, I don't know.
I think we're just trying to make sure that there's a difference between actually surplus, which is what is available to actually then designate through this process or seek a recommendation. And we've had these conversations in the past. And I think the council appreciates this committee sort of weighing in on,
Right.
and this is a, you know, I think there's some of this is accumulating the knowledge of budgets year over year of like, of needs and where those.
I fully
needs are.
appreciate the
But-
way it's laid out. I just think the labels could be clear. I just, and it, my personal preference is it shouldn't be based on prior knowledge. It should be clear as it's laid out.
No. And I'm not saying that the label, yes, I think I would hope, and if there's a suggestion that you have, I wasn't saying that this, in order to understand this, you need to have prior knowledge.
Yeah,
I
no.
was just saying the actual way that we're approaching
Yeah.
conversation about
Yeah,
how much
Sure.
money is available to actually designate for other purposes. It's a little bit different approach.
So that 3.1 million is basically yours. I mean, it's fully discretionary, undesignated for anything else. No,
It's general fund.
It's general fund, undesignated general fund. And again, it can only be used on budgeted items. And we're not going to Vegas or anything like that. It's,
no,
yeah,
I
yeah. So,
appreciate that.
so one example, as I was talking through this with the town manager and through my career, so we have basically $12 million in reserves. The council knows we have $12 million in reserve. So it's June 30th, and we have $12 million in reserves. July 1st through the 30th, the town has to make payment to the insurance fund, CMFA, CalPERS, and so on. And all together, those are about $2.5 to $3 million, right? So we make those payments. And then July 30th, an event happens. And council comes and says, well, great, we got this $12 million on hand. Well, no, I'm sorry, we don't. We just gave $2.5 million to these other agencies. We really have 10 million at this time, but by the end of the year, we'll have 12 million. And that's really what leaving some room in that undesignated area is for. So, there's a play there between the reserves and cash flow and all of that. And so, there's just, again, just kind of point in time and having that room for the in and out and so on that happens, particularly in July through August.
Mhm.
Very front heavy for almost all agencies where they have all of these costs. CalPERS is unaccrued liabilities.
And I think that makes really good sense to me is that reserve is that reserve. When we say there's those reserves available, it's specifically for emergency situations and things like that that may
Okay.
come up at any time.
Okay.
And I am open to suggestions around labels.
Right.
I've
Let me
been
think about
I've been
it,
an
yeah.
accountant all my life, and
Yeah, that's true.
unfortunately, a hammer sees everything as a nail.
That's-
So
yeah, that's fine.
so
but-
I'm really open to
Yeah,
that kind of stuff,
Okay.
and
you.
if you want to give me a call or shoot me an email, or I'll even share the sheet with you, and you say, if it looked
no,
like this,
just,
is
yeah, let me
great.
think about it. And yeah, I think just maybe one or two.
It'd
headlines
be
would make it
helpful
just a
for me,
little
and it'd be
clearer.
helpful for the
Yeah.
public. Very good.
Okay.
Chris, I do have a question. So I follow, the revenues, expenditures, surplus, and also like the ending fund balance that's beginning plus your kind of like your net income that gives your ending fund balance, and you have reserve. The one aspect within the reserve that I'm not fully following is there's a negative 1.4. What is that?
Sure. So But somebody else can probably speak to the underlying what that is, but Park Madera Fund is an investment that the town made at some point, and the town is recognizing the debt. So this is the debt that's on that, and the town has historically recognized what's left of the debt, and so we're collecting rents on that. It is cash positive at this point in time, but this is, as I understand it, and what we're trying to display here is there's a Park Madera fund. It's a separate fund outside of the general fund, and traditionally the town has shown that balance here, and I've just followed suit on that. Other than that, I don't have a lot more to offer than just we've been asked to show that there, and I followed suit on that.
Yeah. And BC, I mean, it relates to a purchase, I think it was around 2008 or so, of the Park Madera Center shopping center that the town made at that time. And has since, and again, I think by policy, it was really a request not only of the prior councils, members of the public and whatnot, to make sure that we're tracking ultimately the debt that is owed on that property. And fortunately, you can see now over, I think we refinanced in about 2017 or 18 at a good rate, which was good at that point. And now, as Chris said, it's just slightly cash flow positive. So the debt is slowly decreasing. And I think the payments are ultimately over about 2037. But in any case, that's what that refers to and why it's sort of hitting that ending fund balance as a negative.
I've always had questions every year about that because my understanding of that Park Madera item is it's sort of the accumulated loss over the years since we've owned it. But it is actually that we could take 1.4 million and pay it to somebody, but that isn't my understanding of how that worked.
It's a fair question. I don't believe that's right. And I think maybe we can have a separate actual conversation because I know we have a payment schedule on the debt over time. I think it's, I think we may be close to a point at which we don't incur like prepayment penalties on paying it off. I mean, there is at some point an option where we may be able to.
Yeah. And I wasn't
So if
suggesting that. I was just trying to clarify.
Understand. No, I understand. And I don't know if that's basically, I would say probably the debt payments, if you added them all up, are going to be more than the 1.4 million. But you want to add?
Sure. I mean, anybody that does loans, particularly around commercial, there's going to be an early payment. They want their interest. So this is really just this is really just the principal portion. I don't think you could take 1.4. They're probably going to want 10 years of interest or something. I don't know what the real answer is.
Yeah.
But to your point, we could look into that, and that might be
because
something for consideration.
The way it had been explained to me in the past, this seemed like a non-cash item, that it was just a basically scorekeeping for Park Madera Center. And this is, the result of the aggregate financials over the course of our ownership. And if that's the case, it isn't really a cash item, and so doesn't necessarily have to be reflected in reserves. But if it's an actual debt, if there's
debt
1.4
payment,
million,
bring in revenue, and we every year we pay down debt. So there's also other expenses that go with it. I know the town manager just approved some modification. Was it HVAC there or?
Yeah.
There's ongoing maintenance. So, I've kind of been entertaining that we consider putting aside a little bit of a reserve within that fund for bigger things. If we have to do a roof or heaven forbid a parking lot, those can be very expensive. That would it would double that easily if we don't have some money for those kinds of things, because it is the town's problem.
okay.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it stands out and it obviously prompted the question tonight. It does seem like the kind of thing that we could spend more time on another time when we have, I mean, like, there's sort of a specific recommendation that we should probably tackle.
Yeah.
This, I know people in the community who are sort of confused and like interested to understand what's going on, and like, so it does seem like an opportunity to spend more time on it later. I would just throw that out.
We could definitely bring that back if that's what you'd like to talk about, and yeah, we can spend some time on it. And then it also, I'll just, it begs the question about the park fund. And that's really the park number that ends up there is revenue minus expenses in what I call Fund 50, which is just park and rec. It really does belong in the general fund, but at some point in time, the request was just asked to bring it out, and the financials, the P&L for that, for the Parks and Rec, because they run all these departments, is much long. It's almost as long as the entire town. It's not that complicated, but they just got a lot of programs and they track revenue and expenses by program. So it would make for a very long individual P&L.
Yeah, I agree with Glenn. I think we should come back to that. I've been around for the whole history of it. I'm sure Larry has as well, but again, for the longer discussion, but I view this as an accumulated deficit, not debt.
That's
This is an accumulated loss.
It's the
Operating
fund balance.
loss.
That's, and that, so you may be right. I'm just moving the
Because
fund.
the debt's a
balance.
lot bigger than this. I believe the debt is a bigger number, but we can save that
Yeah,
for a further
for another
discussion.
meeting.
I guess my thought is, why did it go up? It was forecasted to be just under 1.4 and it came in at 1.42. So what happened?
Rents. We didn't collect the rents we thought we were going to
The
collect.
rents haven't been collected.
Yeah, and I think there was more maintenance there than anticipated.
Okay. The last question I just had was on the general fund reserve, just help us understand, it went from 4.8 million to 5.8 million. That was a $1 million addition. I have some memory of allocation from before.
No, is it for the reserves? It was actually an increase by policy of going from 20% reserve to 25% reserve minimum to a goal with a goal of 30%.
Yeah, I knew there was something behind it. I just wanted to clarify.
So can you clarify to me if this is the total loss? I guess maybe we should, but just why is the total loss in here against reserves? Again, I keep thinking maybe we should take this off, but is it total debt?
Yeah,
Okay,
we'll come
do it off.
back. We'll
Okay.
definitely bring it back, and maybe, you know, I'm open to learning some stuff about it too. It's something that I've carried forward. There's some other items I've had questions about, but particularly this is a big one.
Yeah, I've, like I say, I've watched this and been disappointed with it for ever since it happened. So yes, I think for all of us here, it'd be nice to just set the table now. Where are we with this thing? What's going on? There's been a lot of money going back and forth and on and on. So I think it's a great idea. Have it be an agenda item maybe in the future.
Glad to do it.
Okay.
Did I answer your questions, Ms. Lang?
Yes.
Yes.
pretty
Thank
much.
you.
I don't know if you wanted to talk
We
through the
talked-
recommendations from staff on where.
Thank you. Yes. So so back to the recommendations. So let's see, did I actually write it here? So what we're recommending is that that you consider making a recommendation to council to move $1 million from the general fund into the town capital fund, and then the general fund into the recreation capital fund to help accomplish both the very large projects, the capital improvement programs we have coming, and then also to help accomplish some of the goals that the recreation, Parks and Recreation Department would like to see done. I've also I've updated the packet to include, well, I've included the capital budget, the 5-year plan, and I can put that up here for you. I'd be glad to kind of talk you through any of that. If you have questions about the capital plan. If you have questions about the capital plan. And then I've updated your packets to include both the Recreation Capital Fund. So you can see the current projects that we have proposed that happened in 24, 20, 23, 24, 24, 25, and what we've proposed for 25, 26 and 26, 27. And same for the Town Capital Fund. I've included those as well.
And just on the policy side, I will just mention both, I think it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago now. It's hard to believe, but the town did adopt or approve a park master plan, which was a facility master plan, which highlighted all the different various improvements that the town could make to the various different parks. That was a long public process that had a lot of input into it, meant to capture all the various different needs of the parks, but also there's some maintenance as well, or just existing deficiencies that need to be addressed as well. And so those all require obviously funding on the park side. And then the town capital budget is really what's informing the recommendation, the 5-year projection at this point, which was presented, I think, at the last meeting, but also has been discussed at the budget with the council at the last budget. It's in the budget book this year. And just when you start to look at the out years, and this relates to some of the other work we've done on identifying climate adaptation needs, and specifically both on the flood prevention side of things, but also on wildfire mitigation. Those are just large projects. We are aggressively going to try to go after grant funding. Obviously, those we had, for example, a $1 million FEMA grant approved last year to do design and engineering work. That is no longer the case under the current administration. And so we're looking for other grant fundings to continue that. And hopefully, especially around sea level rise, regionally, we may be looking at potential measures in the future that provide some funding for these sorts of projects. But I don't think we can really just rest on our laurels and anticipate that that's going to come in and solve our problem. So I think my goal in long term is to really try to, as much as we can, start to build up a town capital project fund the same way we've done for some of our other needed infrastructure in the past, so that we can move those projects forward and further along. And at least, and I think the other important thing is we're able to match certain and be ready to go and match maybe some grant funding that might be available when and if the time is right. And we've done that successfully in the past recently. So that's some context for the recommendations.
Can I ask you this? So as I'm looking at this, it appears that there's a capital plan that's put in place by the town council with the funding not necessarily secured. So, or it's optional, okay. So, obviously some alternatives are grants and or taking surpluses, but there's also acquiring debt and or taxes. So the recommendation is to use a surplus. I can see that, but have all sources of funding been explored, including debt, et cetera, and why this, or is this temporary, I guess I'm a little confused that a capital program is put forth without necessarily associated funding recommendations.
Well, I think we do have them in here. I think we're noting that some of the climate adaptation projects, if we're not able to get grant funding for them, they may not happen unless we have
So it's
other
sort of,
sources of funds.
it's either obtain grants or not, or
Yeah,
stop.
or do, where we have a couple of good years now, we're able to fund the next 2 years of our capital program. And so over the next 2 years, we're going to reevaluate, obviously, that question. I think you're right. That's something that we're going to consistently have to do is look at the needs and how critical they are and address, do we have the funds to get those projects done? And so I think right now, the recommendation is, we have we were able to fund 25, 26 and 26, 27. We have, and the additions show we do have some additional balances that haven't actually been programmed yet into like 27, 28 or 2018, 29. But if we're able to build the town capital project fund, that becomes a pretty healthy source as well to actually complete the 5-year capital budget. Even, once we get out to 28, 29 and 29, 30, there's some $4 million numbers there they're basically not in this, the deficit here. Those are the ones where we're going to have to make some decisions. And at that time, yes, there's assessment districts, there's other things that we may have to look at, depending on the critical need and how much money we have to use at that time, and if there are grants available to support us.
And I had one other question relating to the sort of climate related expenditures. Rightfully so, there's these capital projects. But what about short-term disasters? When I look at other towns that have had substantial flooding and or substantial fires, the town has really suffered in the short term. And has there been I realize it's probably not the function of this committee, any discussion of reserves for those?
I mean, those are the reserve. Yeah.
That's what the reserves are for. So, I've been through years of fires in Sonoma County. You have to have money on hand. FEMA might pay you back in 3 or 4 years. That kind of stuff is not for the project that you're doing now. You're getting money back so you can do your next project. So we have reserves in place. That's in my estimation. That's what the 25% general fund reserve, all that money. That's what that's for, is to meet those and to have that cash on hand so that we can get that.
So it's not just liquidity, it's more than that.
Yeah. And getting those right. I mean, obviously we all lacked imagination in 2016 before those fires came through Sonoma, and we tried to be ready for the next one. And there were so many things that we learned through those years. So, I think the town is in a great position.
And just
meet that.
Another, I know I don't want to go on too long, but something that may be emerging, and both Chris and I were at our annual board meeting at our Bay Cities risk pool recently, a couple of weeks ago, and we had a very interesting conversation about, call it earthquake insurance, but how might we start to invest in products that might actually help us in a worst case scenario of an earthquake. Those are still, we need to do it together as a group, and that's why we're a part of a risk pool. It's not something that any individual city or town is going to be able to do, but we're just starting to look at that. So that's another way that we're sort of starting to plan ahead for that type of a disaster as well.
Okay. Thank you.
So when you're talking about the emergency reserve, you're talking about the general fund reserve, that 5.9 million, or is there something beyond that?
All of the cash on hand. Again, back to that scenario I was talking about earlier, you have June 30th and you have the cash balances we were discussing. We go through July and we have all of this money we got to put out. And again, that's why I'm a little protective of that undesignated balance, because that's really your free cash flow, so that you can meet these ins and outs and ebbs and flows, because there's, we don't get all of that money on July 1st. The sales tax comes in monthly increments. The property tax comes in a big glug, usually in December, sometimes in April, depending. So there's a lot of ebb and flow, even though as I was discussing earlier with the chair, it's very consistent on property tax. It usually doesn't move much, but it doesn't come.
Yeah. Well, and I will say, the other reserves that aren't in the general fund, we do have a sales tax reserve, which is $2.5 million. That specifically would go to infrastructure and an emergency sanitary district as well. Has a $2.5 million reserve that could go to capital as well, or any use. These that are listed in the reserves here, some of these are the pension reserves that cannot be used, right? So just want to make sure we're clarifying that. Thanks.
Just to clarify, in the event, and I guess you use the word, it's really important, like lack of imagination. In the event that something unexpected happens next week, essentially it is that 2.5 million that we have on hand to address that sort of you know, infrastructure impact from an unexpected event. Is that fair to say?
That would be in addition to whatever other monies we have available. I think we also have, while we have the general fund reserve, that will continue to allow operations.
Yeah.
And the 25% basically is 3 months of operations, right? And then, yeah, 2.5 million on top of whatever we have on hand, which is what Chris is saying. We have the undesignated right now, which is sort of a cash flow. So then, yeah, that could be money put right away to fixing a major issue. And then then you have to claw that money back, or hopefully we get that.
Yeah.
That back.
And then
from the state.
insurance, but insurance is always, well, not always, but generally it's a reimbursement, and they'll get you the money really quickly, but you still gotta, still gotta put out.
Yeah. Okay.
And then also with insurance, and one of the powerful lessons, and I always ask now, a lot of things are excluded under a lot of these policies. And again, back to that lack of imagination, and I know in Sonoma County, when we went through those fires, everything underground wasn't insured. So anything below grade, and we just never thought of, we were all thinking earthquake. It's fire.
Um,
Has this committee or whatever, have we reviewed your insurance coverage relative to the reserves? Is that worth going over?
I think that if the committee wanted to in the future to topic to go over and talk about how our insurance works, which is basically we're self-insured, but through a pool with other cities, we could have that conversation as well. I mean, it's a dollar. I mean, from the standpoint of finance, I think this year we paid in about $700,000 into our pool, and that covers, it's a longer conversation. I'm certainly happy to get into it, but it's liabilities, workers' comp, what are the other, those are the two major,
Main
one,
lines.
property, of course.
If there's any, well, I would maintain that I think your insurance coverage really, that in combination with your reserves really tells the story of your preparedness. So if there's any small write-up to go along with the reserves, I think that'd be helpful for me. I don't know if people want more information on it.
Okay.
So we do have a couple of attendees, and one is asked to speak. So let's see if I can make the.
So yeah, we're in the question time. So if there are questions, you can go to.
Okay, well, I kind of wanted to bring it back to the recommendations. And can I go on that before we go to questions?
So we're on question. Oh,
Well, we're talking about where this money's going to go. And the staff's made recommendations here.
right.
Do we want to, have we gone through those, or do we want to?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, well, I guess my question is, the staff's, recommending 450,000 to the capital fund, 200 to the recreation fund. Here are the options, but then below they want $1 million to the capital fund.
I was just in the staff report, I was just discussing some options. The recommendation I gave down below was 1 million to capital.
Right.
And 200,000 to park and rec. And of course, that's just staff's recommendation.
Let me just ask, so when you're recommending 1 million to capital, it would be then town council's discretion as to exactly what capital project that goes to?
Yes.
And just to clarify, because I was a little confused also by the jump from 450,000 to $1 million, but I think it's in the wording. It says funding in out for each of the fiscal years 26, 27 and 27, 28. So should we assume that's 450,000 times 2,
Yes.
meaning 900,000? So that is why the recommendation of $1 million is to cover those 900,000 and add 100,000 more.
And to
correct?
go a little further, yes, to kind of.
Thank you. I was confused. Thank you.
Actually, I
I appreciate
explained it to myself as the 450 plus, you look at the Marina Village flood berm, which is in red, I assumed that was a funding that hadn't been identified. Is that not right?
We weren't explicitly tying the two together, but no, the red was just the funding had not been identified, right?
I'm sorry?
You're right. That is correct. The red is the funding hadn't been identified specifically for those projects.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, that's even though I wasn't drawing a line, I am
I guess,
working on my wordsmithing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
just personally, I'm okay with the recommendation.
Sorry.
Yeah, before.
Get into comments. I think we're
Well-
doing questions right now. And so
Okay, but
Carl, I
let-
think.
Let me just, I want to finish this because it is, okay. I feel like unless I have a better picture of the reserves and the insurance, it's hard to recommend taking a surplus and going, putting it in buckets. But I'm okay on this one time. Anybody have any other comments on that?
Well, we should do comments. Now we're on questions, and then you can ask for public open time, and then you bring it back for
Okay.
Okay.
comments and recommendation.
I have no further comments. Anybody?
Nope.
I do have maybe a couple of questions. So one, I want to clarify the numbers in red. Do they represent unfunded projects?
We hadn't specifically identified funds. That's really kind of what we were thinking when
Okay.
this was put together. This is a 5-year plan.
Yep.
It's council, I wanted to make this comment earlier about the 5-year plan. Council, even though we put forward a 2-year budget, really this 5-year plan is only adopted through 26, 27. So really we have identified money for this fiscal year and next fiscal year. Really the money we're asking for is to fund future projects. Let's put this aside so we can do 27, 28. And maybe as we get to the end of 26, 27, we'll have another $1 million to go in. And so the next time you see this, if you make this, again, year 27, 28, we're missing about $1.7 million of, just overall. If this recommendation goes through, then we'll be looking at 750,000, at least at this moment, of things we haven't identified funding for. And if we have a good year again next year, maybe we'll be able to fund all of that and get into the year after that. That's really, in a macro sense, that's the way I was thinking of it. I'm not thinking of the specific projects.
Got it.
But that is correct though.
Okay. And just to confirm, the money in the town capital project fund would fund these capital projects.
Exactly. Any of them, including the Parks and Recreation
Okay.
projects. But if you put money into the Parks and Recreation Fund, that'll really only be spent on Parks and Recreation, as I understand it. And my heart is really in Parks and Rec. I love going to the park. And so that was my little, and I know some council members really kind of have their heart there too. So.
Thanks. For the year 27, 28, if I'm just looking at it, is there an opportunity to move around, like what gets priority? So for example, the road resurfacing project for $1.5 million is in black, but we have some climate adaptation projects in red. Could we prioritize maybe climate adaptation or it doesn't have to be exactly that.
No, and absolutely, these are the conversations that the Public Works Department has with, there's advisory boards, there's a flood board, there's a BPAC, there's a town council, and these get revised pretty much every year, and reprioritized based on need. And so, yes, this will change at some point in the future. We don't necessarily, I put it basically every year we'll revisit. And there may things pop up or there may things get pushed out. And so your cash flow or the expected amount of cash flow that you have for any given year may change.
Got it. So it's safe to assume that we would have roughly around 1.7 deficit right now based on the math here, but the money could be moved around with different projects as needed.
And then you just have actual experience on the ground. You know, we have a really wet winter. We're not doing
Right.
streets this year. You know, really hot summer, you're not doing a lot of concrete when it's 110 degrees for 2 months, you know. So things get pushed around and so on.
Got it. Okay. That's helpful.
And then just to clarify that your added sheet on the town capital beginning and ending fund balance based on our 25, 26 and 27 year budget is expected to have
Yes.
2.382 million in it, not including what we're talking about tonight with this recommendation by the end of 26, 27, which could then be used, is expected to be used to fund town capital projects that are currently included in our 5-year capital budget projection.
Okay. Yep. That makes sense. Thanks.
Okay, if no further questions, you said we have some public questions?
Yeah, let's see if public comment. James?
Yes, can you hear me?
Thank you, James. Good, we can hear you.
Okay, let me see, I would have attended the meeting, but I just got out of traffic, so. I'm
Councilmember Andrews?
Yep. First, Park Madera balance, okay? There's a general fund and there's sort of a sub-account within the general fund, which reflects the subsidy for the preceding deficit for the last decade of that damn project, okay? So that's where the negative number comes from, okay? On a go-forward basis, there's about $500,000 a year, and I'm doing this from memory, so don't quote me on it, but there's about $500,000 of principal that needs to be repaid over the next several years. Some of them, it's like a 400,000, 500,000 principal each year. Then there's like a $5 million, we can call the bonds at that time. And I know when I've scheduled it out, it sort of looked like $500,000 a year going out until the mid-30s. Okay. In terms of reserves, I believe we have I'll call it an operating reserves, which means if a disaster hits and we basically have to pay the workforce for the next several months or few months, that's covered by the operating reserves. The capital reserves are to pay for fixing stuff that gets broken in a disaster. So that's sort of the thought process that went on back then. We can, Chris and I should probably sit down and talk through what some of these numbers are and how we want to describe them and document for future generations how to handle that. The last thing is, I think it'd be useful to see over the last few years, sort of on a month-to-month basis, receipts coming into the town broken down by the main revenue sources, okay? So anybody can sort of look at a chart and see, oh yeah, this revenue stream is very lumpy, this one's very smooth, and so on. And the same would go for cash flows, because we know every month, every half month, we've got a payroll bill. Then we've got big expenditures for CalPERS, the insurance fund, whatever. So that's the extent of my comments. And if any of you have a question for me, I'll try and tell you what I remember. Okay.
Thank you, Councilman Andrews. We really appreciate your help on this.
Okay.
Okay, so I think we can get to the recommendation. Would you like to start, Glenn? Well, would you like to go through each person explaining, or we have a motion to accept the staff's recommendation? Second.
I'll second it.
Okay. So we approve the staff recommendation.
Take a roll
Take a
call
roll,
vote
please.
for, just because it's money on the line. So I'll start down with BC.
I second.
Karen Lang,
Yes.
Glenn Roth. Yes. Larry Reed,
Yes.
Carl Spurson.
Yes.
That motion passes.
Can I just, so I came here supporting the recommendation but the way I lined it up in my head again was that for 26-27, which is next year, we've got two shortfalls, one of 500,000 and one of 450,000 in the capital budget, right? The Marina Village flood berm, and then the shortfall of the total capital budget is so that's where I thought the million made sense. And am I thinking about it right?
Well, yes, I mean, whether it comes from this particular recommendation or the money we already have in our town capital project fund, we will be recommending that we move forward. The problem is, I will just say at some point, it's more of a project management question. So we can do in the $200,000 that we have in there now. One of the things we're trying to do is do design and engineering and get to a certain point where we start to have a big dollar amount. If we're going to do a major levee enhancement project, you're gonna run, and that could be $10 million or something like that. So it starts to become, we can fund up to a certain level. These are estimates. I mean, these are just sort of, we're trying to work with what might help us get to that point where we're going to have this big question of big dollars. And at that point, it gets to more to Karen's question earlier. Are we able to pull in grants for that and we can fund the other, or are we going to have to look at some other funding source options at that point in time? So I think yes, you're plugging some gaps, whether it's there or in the future years.
Well, yeah. I mean, 26-27 is next year. So if we fill these gaps in the capital budget, the general fund budget won't have to put money aside for these.
Correct.
Right. Okay.
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 Thank you very much. And then I think that's it.
Okay. I think we're at the end of it. So Oh.
I just wanted to, so two things. I think we brought up for future items, looking at insurance relative to the reserves, as well as looking at the
Park Madera.
Park Madera.
Yeah.
So maybe two, and I would very much appreciate putting, I'm just, meetings on the calendar way in advance. I was visiting a friend in Big Sur this morning and had to make sure I made it back in time here for this meeting, and I'm scheduling vacations in January. And as soon as we can possibly schedule meetings, that would be really helpful. Okay. All
And I
right.
will send out calendar invites a little earlier.
Okay.
I was just
Wasn't aware they were on the website. I apologize.
I just figured it out.
Okay.
And I will send out calendar invites through Outlook
Okay, that would be
for the
great.
next meeting and everything that we have on the calendar. I'll just get them out there, and
Be
if something
terrific.
changes, at least they're on your calendar.
Thank
As
you.
far as the Outlook invite goes.
Okay. And the two meetings, the suggested topics, whenever it's convenient.
I would just do another third topic on, and this isn't to suggest we need to cover all of these in the next meeting, but there was the insurance review, the Park Madera topic, and then I think the council member mentioned sort of a graph showing income and like
Yes.
stability of income inflows. Anything that can help, I think, us visualize like what is the reliability of our income sources, which ones are more volatile and which ones are more, I don't know, stagnant, would be, I think, useful if that's possible.
And I want to second, I think
Just-
council members mentioned concerns about, mall revenue
Yeah,
in
yeah.
particular. Yeah.
Okay, that, just to clarify, so it's more about volatility year over year of
Yes.
different types of revenues, not cash flow in terms of like when revenues come in during the course of the year.
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
I think, do others agree? I mean,
That's
Yep.
what I was concerned with.
And you're talking about the general fund, not the capital or,
yeah, the general fund.
yeah, yeah, I'm good with that.
Okay,
I'll be giving some of you guys a call to talk.
as long as everyone's done with their ethics.
And
Of course.
Ms. Lang, it's for you.
Everyone done their ethics?
Yes.
November 14th.
Oh, my gosh. Okay,
It's
thank you.
289 slides. It takes 2 hours.
2 hours? Wow.
These slides. Okay,
Yeah.
there you go. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank
You
you.
love to
November
do that.
14th.
Okay.
Actually,
You
completely forgot about that.
you
Thank you.
love that gavel. I can tell
Hey,
you really
it's my
like
first
getting
time
into
ever.
it. Yeah, it's
Oh,
okay.
okay.
Just hang, come on.
And it like actually takes 2 hours to complete that?
You cannot make it go faster.
Do you
Yeah,
have to,
I've
like-
done those things
to-
before, yeah.
It reads the whole slide to you every time.
Oh, wow.
You can't fast forward.
You can't take the cheat test beforehand like I
Put
already
it on
know
the
this.
side and, no.